Give them aid. Aid for what? Actually, we give them aid to keep repressive regimes in power. That's all. Okay, we're not giving them aid for much more except a little bit of infrastructure to make sure those raw materials get to the ports.
Here, someone has finally said it. The West attempts to exploit Africa, offering mere morsels of benefits in return, like alms. Liberia, however, has decided to break this cycle. It has chosen to retaliate against the West by closing the doors to exports. Now, the privileges of being a former master must end, starting with Liberia. But why don't other nations follow suit? Are they compelled not to? If so, by whom? Let's find out. We know Africa has many resources, but what makes it still the world's #1 exporter of these goods and, at the same time, not the producer of stuff from these minerals? But before we get started, let us tell you that Liberia has overcome all the obstacles standing in its way. First, we understand why other African nations are not doing the right thing, and then we will discuss what Liberia did differently. So, what factors contribute to African nations' continued export of valuable minerals and resources despite the potential benefits of local manufacturing? Despite the potential benefits of local manufacturing, African nations' continued export of valuable minerals and resources can be attributed to several interconnected factors deeply rooted in historical, economic, and political contexts. Firstly, colonialism's historical legacy continues to cast a long shadow over the economic structures of numerous African countries, profoundly shaping their trajectories long after independence. Colonial powers, primarily European nations, viewed Africa as a source of valuable raw materials and commodities to fuel their industrialization and economic expansion. This exploitative economic model, established during the colonial era, has left enduring imprints on the socio-economic landscape of the continent. First and foremost, colonial administrations prioritized extracting raw materials over developing local industries within the territories they occupied. This approach was driven by the desire to maximize profits for the colonial powers rather than fostering indigenous economic development. Consequently, African economies became heavily reliant on exporting primary commodities such as minerals, agricultural products, and other natural resources. The infrastructure built during the colonial period was predominantly geared towards facilitating the extraction and transportation of these raw materials to the colonial powers' markets. Roads, railways, and ports were constructed to efficiently transport resources out of Africa, often neglecting investments in infrastructure that could support local industrialization and economic diversification. Furthermore, colonial policies deliberately suppressed indigenous industries that could potentially compete with the industries of the colonial powers. Local manufacturing and artisanal production were undermined or destroyed as colonial authorities imposed trade barriers, tariffs, and other measures to favor goods manufactured in the colonizing countries. This created a dependency on imported manufactured goods, further stifling the growth of domestic industries. The legacy of colonialism also left lasting social and economic inequalities that continue to hinder development efforts in many African countries. The exploitation of labor, the imposition of discriminatory land tenure systems, and the concentration of economic power in the hands of colonial settlers or local elites aligned with colonial interests contributed to enduring patterns of poverty and inequality. Despite gaining political independence, many African nations inherited economic structures, perpetuating their dependence on exporting raw materials. This dependency has proved to be a significant barrier to economic transformation and sustainable development. The lack of diversified industrial bases and value-added production capacities has left African economies vulnerable to external shocks, such as fluctuations in commodity prices and global market dynamics. Secondly, the lack of industrial infrastructure and technological capabilities impedes the development of local manufacturing industries in many African countries. The challenges associated with accessing capital, technology, and skilled labor further exacerbate the dependency on exporting raw materials, perpetuating the cycle of underdevelopment. One of Africa's primary obstacles to industrialization is the limited availability of investment capital, Establishing manufacturing facilities requires substantial upfront infrastructure, machinery, and workforce development investments. However, many African countries face constraints in accessing domestic and foreign investment due to political instability, weak institutional frameworks, and perceived risks associated with investing in emerging markets. Moreover, the high cost of technology transfer presents a formidable barrier to African industrial development. Accessing advanced manufacturing technologies often entails significant licensing fees, royalties, and expenses related to training personnel to operate and maintain these technologies. Many African countries lack the financial resources and technical expertise to acquire and implement cutting-edge technologies, hindering their ability to compete in global markets and add value to their raw materials. Furthermore, the shortage of skilled labor exacerbates the challenges of industrialization in Africa. Building a competent workforce capable of operating complex machinery and engaging in high-value-added manufacturing processes requires substantial investments in education, vocational training, and skills development. However, many African countries struggle to provide quality education and training opportunities, leading to a shortage of skilled workers in key sectors such as engineering, manufacturing, and technology. The lack of supportive infrastructure, such as reliable energy supply, transportation networks, and telecommunication systems, further hampers the growth of manufacturing industries in Africa. Inadequate infrastructure increases production costs, reduces productivity, and undermines the competitiveness of local manufacturers in both domestic and international markets. Then comes the reliance on foreign investment. The reliance on foreign investment in many African nations presents a complex dilemma, as it often reinforces the dependency on multinational corporations and MNCs that prioritize extraction and exportation of raw materials over local manufacturing and value addition. This dynamic perpetuates the historical patterns of economic exploitation and exacerbates the challenges of industrialization and sustainable development. Multinational corporations, attracted by Africa's abundant natural resources and profit potential, frequently engage in extractive industries such as mining, oil and gas, and agribusiness. While these investments can generate revenue and employment opportunities, they often prioritize short-term gains and export-oriented production models, neglecting the development of local manufacturing capabilities and value chains. Furthermore, multinational corporations wield significant economic and political influence due to their financial resources, technological expertise, and global reach. They often negotiate favorable terms with host governments, including tax incentives, regulatory exemptions, and preferential access to land and resources, further entrenching their dominance in key sectors of the economy. This asymmetrical power dynamic can undermine efforts to promote local manufacturing and economic diversification, as multinational corporations may resist policies that incentivize domestic value addition or impose regulatory requirements that increase production costs. Moreover, their control over natural resource sectors can result in environmental degradation, social conflicts, and economic distortions that undermine long-term sustainable development objectives. Additionally, the reliance on foreign investment can create vulnerabilities to external shocks and market fluctuations as African economies become increasingly integrated into global value chains dominated by multinational corporations. Changes in commodity prices, shifts in global demand, and economic downturns in investor countries can profoundly impact the economies of African nations heavily dependent on foreign investment and export revenues. Then there is another problem: trade agreements and market dynamics. Trade agreements and market dynamics significantly influence African nations' economic decisions, often perpetuating the export-oriented model that prioritizes raw material extraction over local manufacturing and value addition. Trade agreements, whether bilateral, regional, or multilateral, can shape the terms of trade and influence the patterns of specialization and investment within African economies. Many agreements negotiated with developed countries or trading blocs have historically favored exporting raw materials from Africa in exchange for manufactured goods or services. Such agreements may include preferential tariffs for raw material exports or regulatory provisions that facilitate the access of multinational corporations to African markets. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. These trade agreements, while providing access to international markets and foreign investment, can also constrain the ability of African nations to pursue policies that promote local manufacturing and economic diversification. Provisions related to intellectual property rights, investment protection, and dispute settlement mechanisms may limit the policy space of African governments to regulate foreign investment or implement industrial policies that prioritize domestic value addition. Moreover, market dynamics, including fluctuating commodity prices and demand, can pressure African countries to prioritize exports over local manufacturing. When global prices for commodities are high, there may be strong incentives to extract and export raw materials to maximize revenue in the short term. In contrast, the perceived risks and uncertainties associated with investing in local manufacturing industries, such as volatility in input costs, regulatory changes, and market competition, may discourage long-term investments in value-added production. Political and governance challenges further exacerbate the situation. Political instability, corruption, and weak governance structures can hinder efforts to develop local manufacturing industries. Resource mismanagement, lack of regulatory enforcement, and obstacles to business development also impede progress toward industrialization. Also, the external pressures and interests, particularly those exerted by Western powers and multinational corporations, play a significant role in reinforcing the status quo of exporting raw materials from African nations. These external actors often leverage their economic, political, and diplomatic influence to maintain the existing economic order, aligning with their interests and priorities. Western powers, historically influential in global economic affairs, often pursue policies and strategies that prioritize access to and control over natural resources in Africa. This can manifest through trade agreements that favor exporting raw materials to Western markets, investment conditions prioritizing multinational corporations' interests, or political interventions aimed at safeguarding strategic interests in resource-rich regions. Multinational corporations, particularly those engaged in extractive industries such as mining, oil and gas, and agribusiness, wield significant economic power and influence in African economies. These corporations often operate within a framework that prioritizes profit maximization and shareholder value, leading them to focus on extracting and exporting raw materials rather than investing in local manufacturing and value addition. Moreover, multinational corporations may actively lobby governments and international institutions to maintain favorable trade and investment conditions, perpetuating their dependency on raw material exports. This can include resisting efforts to implement regulations or policies that promote local content requirements, technology transfer, or environmental sustainability in resource extraction and processing activities. Furthermore, Western governments and multinational corporations may utilize their political and diplomatic leverage to influence the policy decisions of African governments, either through direct engagement, financial incentives, or coercion. This can result in adopting policies and strategies that prioritize the interests of external actors over the long-term development needs of African nations. The combined effect of these external pressures and interests reinforces the status quo of exporting raw materials from Africa, perpetuating economic dependency, inequality, and underdevelopment patterns. Addressing this entrenched dynamic requires concerted efforts to promote inclusive and sustainable development, empower local communities, strengthen domestic institutions, and foster greater economic self-reliance. Now comes Liberia in the sense. How does Liberia's history of European colonization impact its current economic situation and dependency on raw material exports? Liberia's history of European colonization has profoundly influenced its current economic situation and its dependency on raw material exports. Established as a settlement for freed African American slaves in the 19th century, Liberia's colonial history intersects with broader patterns of European imperialism and economic exploitation in Africa. During the colonial era, European powers, particularly Britain and France, significantly influenced Liberia's development. While Liberia itself was not colonized in the same manner as many other African nations, it was heavily influenced by external powers, particularly in economic terms. One of the key legacies of colonialism in Liberia is establishing an economic model centered around extracting and exporting raw materials. European colonial powers and later American interests primarily sought to exploit Liberia's abundant natural resources, including rubber, timber, and minerals, for export to their home countries. This economic model left Liberia with a dual legacy. On one hand, it endowed the country with valuable natural resources that could fuel economic development. On the other hand, it entrenched a pattern of dependency on raw material exports, with limited value addition occurring within the country. The infrastructure and institutions that developed during the colonial period were largely geared toward facilitating the extraction and exportation of raw materials. This resulted in a lack of investment in domestic industries and limited diversification of the economy beyond resource extraction. Furthermore, the terms of engagement with foreign companies, particularly in industries like rubber, were often skewed in favor of external interests. Companies like Firestone, which established significant operations in Liberia's rubber sector, benefited from favorable concessions and agreements prioritizing their interests over those of the local population. As a result, Liberia's economy became heavily reliant on exports of raw materials, with limited industrialization and value addition occurring within the country. This dependency has persisted into the present day, shaping Liberia's economic landscape and contributing to challenges such as limited job creation, uneven development, and vulnerability to fluctuations in global commodity prices. But Liberia taught the West a lesson. Liberia has taken specific steps to reclaim control over its resources, with a significant focus on the recent decision to halt the export of unprocessed rubber. Here are the key actions Liberia has taken. In November 2023, the President issued Executive Order 124, temporarily halting the export of unprocessed rubber. This strategic decision aimed to fortify Liberia's rubber industry by promoting local manufacturing and producing finished goods. It signaled a departure from the country's historical reliance on exporting raw materials. The executive order was designed to promote local manufacturing by encouraging rubber processing within Liberia rather than exporting it raw. By adding value to the raw material through processing and manufacturing, Liberia aimed to capture more of the economic benefits within its borders. The decision to halt the export of unprocessed rubber was intended to benefit small-scale rubber farmers in Liberia. The government sought to provide these farmers with better market access, fairer prices, and increased economic opportunities by promoting local processing and manufacturing. Executive Order 124 established a regulatory framework to enforce the ban on the export of unprocessed rubber. It prohibited government entities from issuing export permits for unprocessed rubber and instructed customs officers and law enforcement personnel to prevent its export. Liberia has begun investing in processing infrastructure to support the transition towards local processing. This includes initiatives to establish processing plants, train workers, and improve access to technology and equipment necessary for rubber processing. The Liberian government has also engaged with stakeholders in the rubber industry, including rubber planters, exporters, and industry associations, to discuss the executive order's implications and gather feedback on its implementation. This engagement has aimed to address concerns and ensure a collaborative approach to the transition. How does the ban on unprocessed rubber exports align with broader national benefits from natural resources? Liberia's ban on unprocessed rubber exports aligns closely with broader Pan-African movements seeking to optimize national benefits from natural resources. The decision reflects a growing sentiment across Africa for greater sovereignty and control over natural resources. Many African nations have historically been exploited for their resources, often to the benefit of external powers. By imposing restrictions on the export of unprocessed rubber, Liberia asserts its right to manage its resources in a manner that prioritizes national development and benefits its citizens. The ban on unprocessed rubber exports aligns with efforts to promote value addition and industrialization within Africa. Instead of exporting raw materials at a lower value, African countries seek to add value through processing and manufacturing, thereby capturing more economic benefits within their borders. This strategy contributes to developing local industries, job creation, and economic diversification. Pan-African movements advocate for economic empowerment and wealth creation for African nations and their citizens. By halting the export of unprocessed rubber, Liberia aims to empower local rubber farmers and promote their economic interests. By processing rubber domestically, Liberia can generate higher revenues, create employment opportunities, and foster entrepreneurship, thereby contributing to broader economic empowerment goals. African nations aspire to reduce their dependence on external markets and foreign investors, particularly in resource-dependent sectors. The ban on unprocessed rubber exports represents a step towards reducing Liberia's reliance on external buyers and multinational corporations. Liberia aims to build resilience and self-sufficiency in its rubber industry by promoting local processing and manufacturing, reducing vulnerability to external market fluctuations and influences. The ban on unprocessed rubber exports aligns with efforts to promote regional integration and intra-African trade. By encouraging local processing and manufacturing, Liberia can contribute to the growth of regional value chains and trade networks. This fosters economic cooperation and collaboration among African countries, leading to mutual benefits and shared prosperity. And what are the implications of Liberia's decision for its relationship with former colonial powers? The decision will strain Liberia's relations with former colonial powers, particularly if those powers have vested interests in Liberia's natural resources. Former colonial powers will view the ban on unprocessed rubber exports as a threat to their economic interests or a challenge to their historical influence over Liberia's economy. Tensions could arise if former colonial powers perceive Liberia's actions as undermining their control or disrupting established economic relationships. Companies like Firestone, which has significant investments and operations in Liberia's rubber sector, contest the ban on unprocessed rubber exports. The halt in exports could disrupt established business models and revenue streams for foreign investors, leading to potential conflicts and legal challenges. Firestone, in particular, has a long history of operations in Liberia and may resist measures that impact its business interests. Liberia's decision could impact its trade relations with foreign stakeholders, including countries that rely on rubber imports and other natural resources. If the ban on unprocessed rubber exports leads to reduced supply or increased prices in global markets, it may affect trade dynamics and diplomatic relations with importing countries. Liberia may need to navigate potential trade disputes or negotiations with foreign partners affected by the policy change. The decision will also have economic repercussions for Liberia and its foreign stakeholders. If the ban on unprocessed rubber exports leads to increased local processing and manufacturing, it could stimulate economic growth and job creation within Liberia. However, if export volumes decline, it may also lead to reduced profits for foreign companies and potential revenue loss for the Liberian government. Balancing these economic interests will be crucial for maintaining stability and growth. Now, how do Liberian policymakers and economists envision the country's economic future, particularly regarding diversification and job creation? Policymakers recognize the importance of diversifying Liberia's economy beyond its reliance on raw material exports, such as rubber and minerals. Diversification involves developing other sectors, such as agriculture, manufacturing, services, and technology, to create a more resilient and balanced economy. Liberia can better withstand external shocks and foster long-term economic stability by reducing dependency on a few key industries. There is a concerted effort to promote manufacturing and value addition within Liberia. Policymakers see manufacturing as a critical driver of economic growth and job creation, as it allows for the transformation of raw materials into finished goods for domestic consumption and export. Liberia aims to capture more value within its borders by encouraging local processing and manufacturing industries, creating employment opportunities, and stimulating economic development. Infrastructure development is essential for supporting economic diversification and job creation in Liberia. This includes investments in transportation networks, energy infrastructure, telecommunications, and access to water and sanitation services. Improved infrastructure facilitates the movement of goods and people, attracts investment, enhances productivity, and spurs economic activity across various sectors. Also, human capital development is a priority for Liberia's economic future. Policymakers recognize the importance of investing in education, vocational training, and skills development to equip the workforce with the capabilities needed for diverse sectors, including manufacturing, technology, and services. By improving access to quality education and training programs, Liberia can enhance the employability of its citizens and foster innovation and entrepreneurship. Policymakers aim to support the growth of SMEs as engines of economic growth and job creation. SMEs drive innovation, create employment opportunities, and promote inclusive economic development. Initiatives such as access to finance, business development services, and regulatory reforms can help SMEs thrive and contribute to economic diversification. Overall, Liberia has fallen out of the old loop of being exploited. Now, it challenges those using it and is more concerned about its benefits. Do you think more nations should do what Liberia is doing? Why benefit the West this much when it keeps you at a loss? Let us know in the comment section if any type of partnership with the West benefits Africa in any way. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.